They escaped Nazi Germany, only to return wearing United States uniforms. Their weapon was not the gun, it was the mind. In the summer of 1944, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, thousands of American soldiers carried rifles, grenades, and the weight of liberation on their shoulders. But among them walked a different kind of warrior. Men who spoke perfect German. Men who understood the enemy because they had once been part of that world. Men who had fled persecution, rebuilt their lives across an ocean, and now returned to face the very regime that had forced them into exile. They were Jews. They were refugees. They were intellectuals, artists, students, boys, who had escaped with nothing but their lives and their accents still thick with the language of their tormentors, and they became one of the most devastating intelligence forces the United States has ever deployed. They were called the Ritchie Boys. Between 1942 and 1945, nearly 2,000 of these men, most of them German and Austrian Jews who had fled Nazi persecution, were trained in the mountains of Maryland at a place so secret, even their families didn't know what they did there. They learned the art of interrogation, psychological warfare, and intelligence gathering. And when they landed in Europe, they extracted information that would save thousands of Allied lives, shorten the war, and help bring down the Third Reich from within. But for decades, their story was classified, forgotten, erased from the history books. Until now, this is the story of the Ritchie Boys, the refugees who became America's secret weapon in World War II. To understand the Ritchie Boys, you must first understand what they fled. Germany in the 1930s was a nation in transformation, but not the kind the world had hoped for after the devastation of the First World War. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and within months, the democratic Weimar Republic began its rapid collapse into totalitarian nightmare. For Germany's Jewish population, more than 500,000 people who had lived, worked, and contributed to German society for generations, the change was sudden and absolute. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped Jews of their citizenship, their rights, their livelihoods. Jewish children were expelled from schools. Jewish professors lost their positions at universities. Jewish doctors, lawyers, musicians, and merchants watched as their careers, their dignity, and their futures evaporated overnight. But the laws were only the beginning. On the night of November 9th, 1938, a night that would become known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, Nazi paramilitary forces and German civilians rampaged through Jewish neighborhoods across Germany and Austria. Synagogues burned, shop windows shattered, homes were looted, nearly 100 Jews were murdered, and over 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The message was clear: there was no future for Jews in Nazi Germany, and so they fled. Between 1933 and 1941, over 300,000 Jews escaped Germany and Austria, scattering across Europe, South America, and beyond. Many were turned away at borders, denied visas, trapped by quotas and bureaucratic indifference. But some, the fortunate few, made it to America. They arrived with suitcases and shattered lives. Many were teenagers, separated from their families, sent ahead by parents who hoped their children might survive even if they did not. They spoke little English. They had no money, no connections, no clear path forward. They were the lucky ones. Among them was a boy named Stefan Heym, who would later become a celebrated novelist. Guy Stern, who had escaped at age 15, leaving his parents and siblings behind, none of whom would survive the Holocaust. Werner Engris, who fled to Amsterdam before making it to America. Martin Selling, who escaped Vienna just weeks after the Anschluss. The Nazi annexation of Austria in 1938. These young men carried trauma, guilt, and a gnawing question. How do you live in safety when your family is still in danger? How do you rebuild when everything you knew has been destroyed? For a time, they tried to become American. They learned English, took jobs, attended school. Some changed their names to sound less German, less Jewish, less foreign. They wanted to blend in, to disappear into the fabric of their new country, but history would not let them disappear. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States entered World War II, and suddenly, these refugees, these young men who had fled one war, found themselves standing at the edge of another. Only this time, they would not run. When America entered World War II, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Millions of young men enlisted or were drafted into the armed forces. Factory workers became soldiers, students became sailors, farmers became pilots, and refugees became soldiers too. For the German and Austrian Jews who had fled to America, enlistment was not a simple act of patriotism. It was personal. This was not just a war between nations. It was a war between everything they had lost and everything they hoped to build. It was a war against the regime that had destroyed their families, stolen their childhoods, and turned their homeland into a graveyard. They volunteered by the thousands. But the U.S. Army didn't quite know what to do with them. These men spoke German fluently, understood German culture intimately, and possessed knowledge that no native-born American soldier could replicate. Yet they were also classified as enemy aliens, technically citizens of hostile nations, even though they had fled those nations in terror. Some were initially rejected for service. Others were accepted but assigned to menial roles, their skills and backgrounds overlooked. A few were even placed in internment camps alongside German POWs, the ultimate irony, imprisoned by the country they had fled to, surrounded by men who represented everything they despised. But within the War Department, a few strategic minds recognized the potential. If America was going to fight Germany, it needed to understand Germany. It needed intelligence, not just about troop movements and supply lines, but about psychology, culture, morale. It needed people who could interrogate prisoners, analyze propaganda, and infiltrate enemy thinking. It needed the very people Hitler had tried to destroy. In 1942, the U.S. military established the Military Intelligence Training Center at a remote location in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Maryland. The site was chosen for its isolation, far from prying eyes, surrounded by forests and farmland. Accessible only by winding country roads, it was called Camp Ritchie, and it would become the birthplace of one of the most effective intelligence operations in American military history. The recruitment was quiet, almost secretive. Word spread through refugee communities, through synagogues and aid organizations, through networks of displaced Europeans who had found each other in their new American cities. The message was simple. If you speak German, if you understand the enemy, if you want to fight back, we need you. For many of these young men, the decision was instantaneous. Guy Stern later recalled, "I wanted to help destroy the people who destroyed my family." Werner Angres said, "I had a debt to pay to America for taking me in. But I also had a score to settle with Germany. They came from New York and Chicago, from small towns and crowded tenements. Some were intellectuals, poets, philosophers, students who had been expelled from European universities. Others were tradesmen, clerks, or teenagers who had barely finished school before fleeing. What united them was language, loss, and an unshakable resolve to turn their suffering into purpose. By early 1943, Camp Ritchie was receiving recruits at a steady pace. Not all of them were German Jews. The camp trained intelligence specialists from many backgrounds, including native-born Americans, refugees from other occupied countries, and even some German POWs who had defected to the Allied cause. But the core of the program, the men who would become its most effective operatives, were the refugees. They were given a choice: remain enemy aliens, viewed with suspicion and sidelined from the war effort, or become American soldiers and use their knowledge as a weapon. They chose to fight. But Camp Ritchie was not a typical training camp. These men would not learn to fire artillery or charge across open fields. They would learn something far more dangerous. They would learn to break the human mind. Camp Ritchie sat nestled in the mountains of northern Maryland, just south of the Pennsylvania border. It was a place of contradictions, beautiful and isolated, peaceful and intense. The surrounding forests were thick with oak and pine. The air was clean and cool. It looked like a summer retreat, not a training ground for psychological warfare. But inside the camp's nondescript wooden barracks and unmarked buildings, something extraordinary was taking place. The Military Intelligence Training Center at Camp Ritchie was unlike any other facility in the U.S. Armed Forces. There were no massive parade grounds, no endless drills with rifles and bayonets. The training was cerebral, psychological, and deeply strategic. The camp could accommodate about 2,000 men at a time, cycling through courses that lasted between 8 and 12 weeks. Over the course of the war, more than 19,000 soldiers would pass through Camp Ritchie's gates. But among them, nearly 2,000 were German-speaking refugees, the men who would come to be known as the Ritchie Boys. Upon arrival, the recruits were briefed on one critical rule: everything they learned at Camp Ritchie was classified. They could not discuss their training with anyone outside the program, not their friends, not their families, not even other soldiers. Camp Ritchie officially didn't exist. The curriculum was designed by some of the most brilliant minds in military intelligence, psychologists, linguists, interrogation experts, and strategists who understood that modern warfare was as much about information as firepower. The goal was simple: train men to extract intelligence from enemy soldiers, analyze enemy documents, and provide commanders with the knowledge needed to win battles before the first shot was fired. The courses were divided into specialized tracks. Some men were trained in interrogation, the art of questioning prisoners of war. They studied psychology, body language, and persuasion techniques. They learned how to detect lies, exploit fears, and build rapport. The objective was not brutality, it was precision. A skilled interrogator could extract more valuable information with empathy and strategy than with violence or threats. Other recruits focused on photo interpretation, analyzing aerial reconnaissance images to identify troop positions, supply depots, and defensive fortifications. They learned to spot camouflage, distinguish between decoys and real targets, and predict enemy movements based on patterns visible only from above. Some studied order of battle analysis, piecing together the structure of enemy units by examining captured documents, letters, uniforms, and insignia. A single dog tag or paybook could reveal which regiment a prisoner belonged to, where his unit had been deployed, and what resources it had available. And still others were trained in psychological warfare, crafting propaganda, designing leaflets to be dropped over enemy lines, and developing loudspeaker scripts meant to demoralize German troops and encourage surrender. But for the Ritchie Boys, the German-speaking refugees, the most critical training was interrogation. They were taught that every captured German soldier was a potential source of life-saving intelligence. A frightened 18-year-old private might know the location of his unit's ammunition dump. A weary sergeant could reveal troop morale or supply shortages. An officer, carefully questioned, might expose the location of minefields, artillery positions, or even the plans for a counterattack. The instructors drilled one principle into their students: the interrogation begins the moment the prisoner is captured. A confused, disoriented soldier just pulled from a battlefield is at his most vulnerable. He's frightened, exhausted, and desperate to survive. In those first minutes, before he has time to collect himself or remember his training to resist questioning, a skilled interrogator can extract critical information. The Ritchie Boys learned to approach prisoners with a blend of authority and humanity. They were taught to offer water, cigarettes, medical attention, small acts of kindness that broke down psychological barriers. They learned phrases designed to build trust. The war is over for you. Your duty is done. Now it's about survival. They also learned deception. Interrogators sometimes posed as Red Cross workers, sympathetic fellow Germans, or even captured soldiers themselves. They created false identities, fabricated stories, and used psychological manipulation to make prisoners believe cooperation was in their best interest. But the most effective tool the Ritchie Boys had was their authenticity. They spoke German not as translators, but as natives. They understood regional dialects, cultural references, and the mentality of the German soldier. They knew the cities prisoners came from, the schools they attended, the songs they sang as children. This cultural fluency made them disarming and devastatingly effective. One trainee later recalled, "We didn't need to pretend to be German. We were German, we just weren't Nazis." The training was intense, often running from dawn until late into the night. The recruits studied maps of European terrain, memorized German military ranks and insignia, and practiced interrogation scenarios with instructors playing the role of captured prisoners. They also trained physically, learning to navigate behind enemy lines, survive in hostile terrain, and defend themselves in close combat. Though their primary weapon was their mind, they still had to be soldiers. By the summer of 1944, the Ritchie Boys were ready. The Allied invasion of Europe was underway. The Normandy landings had succeeded, but the fight for France had just begun. The War Department knew that the intelligence gathered in the coming months could determine whether the war ended in 1944 or dragged on for years. And so, the Ritchie Boys were deployed. They boarded ships bound for England, then crossed the Channel to France. They joined frontline units, intelligence divisions, and special operations teams. Some landed on the beaches days after D-Day. Others parachuted behind enemy lines. A few infiltrated enemy-held territory disguised as German soldiers. They carried notebooks, not rifles. They asked questions, not for surrender, and they changed the course of the war. To truly understand what made the Ritchie Boys so effective, we must go deeper into the training that forged them. Camp Ritchie was not producing warriors in the traditional sense. It was producing thinkers, men who could outmaneuver the enemy not on the battlefield, but in the spaces between words, in the psychology of fear and trust, in the careful analysis of a single captured document. The interrogation training was built on a foundation of psychological principles developed over years of military research. The instructors emphasized that violence was not only morally wrong, but tactically ineffective. A tortured prisoner would say anything to stop the pain. True information, false information, whatever he thought his captors wanted to hear. But intelligence based on lies was worse than no intelligence at all. Instead, the Ritchie Boys learned the art of persuasion. One technique was called pride and ego down. The interrogator would challenge the prisoner's sense of competence or loyalty, subtly suggesting that he had been abandoned by his superiors or that his comrades had already talked. The goal was to make the prisoner feel that cooperation was not betrayal, but simply acknowledging a reality that everyone else already knew. Another method was emotional love. Interrogators would express sympathy for the prisoner's situation, acknowledge the difficulty of his circumstances, and frame cooperation as a way to protect himself or his comrades. "You didn't start this war," an interrogator might say. "You're just a soldier following orders. Help us end this, and you can go home." The Ritchie Boys also learned the Mutt and Jeff technique, later popularized in American police work as good cop, bad cop. Two interrogators would work in tandem. One would be harsh and accusatory, creating fear and stress. Then he would leave. And the second interrogator, calm, reasonable, compassionate, would offer the prisoner relief from that stress in exchange for information. But beyond these techniques, the Ritchie Boys had a profound advantage: cultural empathy. These men understood German soldiers because they had once been German boys. They knew what it was like to grow up under Nazi propaganda, to be taught that the Führer was infallible, to believe that Germany's cause was righteous. They also knew what it was like to see that illusion shatter, to realize that the regime was built on lies, cruelty, and mass murder. This empathy made them extraordinary interrogators. They could connect with prisoners on a human level, even while extracting intelligence that would be used against the German military. One Ritchie boy later said, "I didn't hate the soldiers I interrogated. I hated what they represented. But they were victims too, victims of a system that destroyed everyone it touched." In addition to interrogation, the Ritchie Boys trained in signals intelligence, intercepting and decoding enemy communications. They learned to recognize German radio procedures, encryption patterns, and transmission styles. A single intercepted radio message could reveal the movement of an entire division. They studied terrain analysis, learning to read topographic maps and predict where enemy forces would position their defenses. They examined German equipment, weapons, uniforms, vehicles, memorizing details that could help identify enemy units in the field. And they trained in counterintelligence, learning to detect German spies, identify double agents, and protect Allied intelligence operations from infiltration. The training was exhausting and relentless, but the recruits understood what was at stake. Every skill they mastered could save lives, Allied lives, and potentially the lives of civilians still trapped under Nazi occupation. By the spring of 1944, the first cohorts of Ritchie Boys were graduating and receiving their orders. The invasion of Europe was imminent. The intelligence these men would gather in the coming weeks would determine the success or failure of the largest military operation in history. And so, they deployed. Some went to England, joining the buildup of forces preparing for D-Day. Others were assigned to units already fighting in Italy. A few were sent to the Pacific Theater, where their language skills in Japanese or other languages were needed. But the vast majority went to France, and when they arrived, they got to work immediately. On June 6, 1944, the world changed. Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history. By the end of that first day, over 156,000 troops had landed in France. Thousands had died, but the foothold was established. Among the soldiers who crossed the English Channel in the days and weeks following D-Day were the Ritchie Boys. They landed at Omaha Beach, Utah Beach, and the British sectors. They waded through the surf, climbed the bluffs, and walked past the wreckage of war, destroyed bunkers, shattered equipment, bodies still being cleared from the sand. But unlike most soldiers, the Ritchie Boys were not there to hold ground. They were there to gather intelligence. Within hours of the invasion, German prisoners began flooding Allied lines. Some had been captured during the beach assaults. Others surrendered in the hedgerow battles inland. By the end of June, tens of thousands of German soldiers were in Allied custody, and the Ritchie Boys went to work. They set up interrogation tents just behind the front lines, crude, camouflage shelters where prisoners were brought immediately after capture. The conditions were chaotic. Artillery fire boomed in the distance. Wounded soldiers were being evacuated. Commanders were demanding information. Where are the enemy's reserves? What's the strength of the next defensive line? Are there panzers nearby? The Ritchie Boys had to deliver answers, fast. One Ritchie boy, Guy Stern, later described his first interrogation in Normandy. The prisoner was a young German soldier, no older than 19, covered in dirt and blood. He was terrified, shaking, convinced he was going to be executed. Stern approached him calmly, speaking in flawless German. "What's your name?" he asked. The soldier stammered his name and rank. "Where are you from?" "Berlin. I know Berlin," Stern said. "Kurfürstendamm, Alexanderplatz, beautiful city. Do you have family there?" The soldier nodded, tears welling in his eyes. Stern offered him water and a cigarette. He spoke gently, not as an enemy but as a fellow German, and slowly the prisoner began to talk. He revealed his unit, his position, the location of his command post. He didn't even realize he was giving away valuable intelligence. He was just talking to someone who understood him. Within 15 minutes, Stern had extracted the information his commanders needed. He sent the report forward, and within hours, Allied artillery targeted the German command post, neutralizing a key defensive position. This was the power of the Ritchie Boys. Not brute force, not torture, just empathy, psychology, and language. As the Allies pushed deeper into France, the Ritchie Boys became indispensable. They accompanied infantry units, armored divisions, and reconnaissance teams. They interrogated prisoners at the front lines, sometimes within sight of enemy positions. They analyzed captured documents, letters, maps, supply lists, piecing together the puzzle of German strength and strategy. One of the most valuable contributions of the Ritchie Boys was identifying German units. The Wehrmacht was a massive, complex organization with hundreds of divisions, regiments, and battalions. By questioning prisoners and examining captured documents, the Ritchie Boys could determine which units were in the area, how depleted they were, and what their morale was like. This intelligence allowed Allied commanders to make informed decisions. If a German division was undermanned and demoralized, it could be attacked aggressively. If a fresh Panzer division had just arrived, it might be wiser to hold back and call in air support. The Ritchie Boys also played a critical role in the breakout from Normandy. In late July 1944, Allied forces launched Operation Cobra, a massive offensive designed to punch through German lines and sweep across France. The success of the operation depended on knowing where German defenses were weakest. Ritchie Boys, working with reconnaissance units, provided that intelligence. They interrogated prisoners captured during probing attacks, analyzed aerial photographs, and cross-referenced captured maps. Their reports revealed gaps in German defenses, allowing American armored divisions to exploit those gaps and pour into the French countryside. By August, the Allies were racing toward Paris, and the Ritchie Boys were with them every step of the way. But their work was not without danger. Ritchie Boys often operated close to the front lines, sometimes ahead of them. They wore US uniforms, but if captured by German forces, they faced a terrifying fate. As German-speaking Jews who had fled the Reich, they were considered traitors. If their identities were discovered, they would not be treated as prisoners of war. They would be executed, likely on the spot. To protect themselves, many Ritchie Boys carried false identity papers and used anglicized names. They trained to speak English with American accents, suppressing the German inflections that might give them away. But the risk was always there, a shadow that followed them through every mission. Despite the danger, they pressed forward. As the Allies advanced through France, Belgium, and into Germany itself, the Ritchie Boys continued their work. They interrogated thousands of prisoners, analyzed mountains of captured documents, and provided intelligence that shaped the course of the war. And they did it all while carrying the knowledge that somewhere in the occupied territories, their families were still trapped or already dead. There is a particular kind of heroism that history rarely celebrates, the heroism of intelligence. It does not come with medals pinned on the battlefield or photographs of soldiers raising flags. It is quiet, invisible, and often forgotten, but it saves lives. The Ritchie Boys were heroes of this invisible battle. While infantrymen stormed German positions and pilots bombed enemy supply lines, the Ritchie Boys fought a different war, a war of information. And in that war, they were devastatingly effective. Historians now estimate that the intelligence gathered by the Ritchie Boys provided approximately 60% of the actionable intelligence on German forces in Europe. 60%. That means more than half of the tactical and strategic decisions made by Allied commanders. Decisions about where to attack, where to defend, where to deploy resources, were based on information extracted by these men. Let that sink in for a moment. The outcome of battles, the survival of entire divisions, the success of operations that would determine the war's course, all depended on the intelligence the Ritchie Boys provided. One of their most significant contributions came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last major offensive of the war, a desperate, all-or-nothing assault through the Ardennes forest in Belgium. The attack caught the Allies by surprise. German forces, thought to be on the verge of collapse, suddenly erupted through American lines, creating a massive bulge in the Allied front. In the chaos of the initial assault, thousands of American soldiers were cut off, surrounded, or killed. The weather was brutal. Freezing cold, heavy snow, low clouds that grounded Allied air support. It was one of the darkest moments of the war for the U.S. Army, but the Ritchie Boys helped turn the tide. As German prisoners were captured during the battle, Ritchie Boys interrogated them with ruthless efficiency. They pieced together the German plan, identifying which units were involved, where their supply lines were, and how long they could sustain the offensive. One Ritchie Boy, Werner Angris, interrogated a captured German officer who revealed that his division was running out of fuel. The Germans had gambled everything on capturing Allied fuel depots in the early stages of the attack. When those depots were successfully defended, the German advance began to falter. This intelligence was passed up the chain of command, and Allied forces shifted their strategy. Instead of retreating, they held key positions and waited for the German offensive to stall. Within weeks, the Germans had exhausted their resources, and the Allies launched a devastating counterattack. The Battle of the Bulge was the last time Germany would threaten the Allied advance, and the Ritchie Boys had played a crucial role in ensuring that outcome. Another critical contribution came in the realm of psychological warfare. The Ritchie Boys didn't just gather intelligence, they used it to break enemy morale. psychological warfare units. They crafted propaganda designed to encourage German soldiers to surrender. They designed leaflets called Safe Conduct Passes, printed in German and dropped over enemy lines by the thousands. The leaflets promised fair treatment to any German soldier who surrendered with the pass in hand. They included messages like, "The war is lost. Why die for nothing? Surrender and live." These leaflets were remarkably effective. Many German soldiers, especially later in the war, were exhausted, disillusioned, and desperate to survive. The Safe Conduct Passes gave them a rationale to surrender without feeling like they were betraying their comrades. Ritchie Boys also operated loudspeaker units at the front lines. Using mobile sound systems, they broadcast messages in German across no man's land. Sometimes the messages were tactical. "You are surrounded. Lay down your arms." Other times they were personal. "Christmas is coming. Do you want to die in a frozen trench or go home to your family?" One particularly effective operation involved using recordings of German prisoners. Ritchie Boys would record statements from captured soldiers, men who described the hopelessness of the war, the lies they had been told by Nazi leadership, and the relief they felt after surrendering. These recordings were then broadcast to German positions, creating doubt and undermining morale. The impact was measurable. Psychological warfare operations contributed to thousands of surrenders, reducing the need for costly assaults and saving Allied lives. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Ritchie Boys' work was their ability to extract strategic intelligence, information that affected not just individual battles, but the entire war effort. In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Berlin, the Ritchie Boys interrogated high-ranking German officers and Nazi officials. These interrogations revealed the inner workings of the Nazi regime, the locations of hidden weapons caches, and the plans for a rumored Alpine fortress, where die-hard Nazis supposedly intended to make a final stand. Though the Alpine fortress turned out to be more myth than reality, the intelligence gathered by the Ritchie Boys ensured that Allied commanders were prepared for any contingency. It also helped identify war criminals, leading to arrests that would later support the Nuremberg trials. The Ritchie Boys also played a role in the race to secure German scientific and military technology. They interrogated German scientists, engineers, and military researchers, gathering information about advanced weapons programs, jet aircraft, and rocket technology. This intelligence contributed to Operation Paperclip, the controversial U.S. program that recruited German scientists to work for America after the war. Every piece of intelligence the Ritchie Boys gathered had a ripple effect. A single interrogation could lead to the discovery of a weapons depot. That depot's destruction could delay a German counterattack. That delay could save dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of lives. The invisible battle they fought was as important as any fought with bullets and bombs, and yet, for decades, almost no one knew their names. There was a particular moment that Guy Stern never forgot. It was late 1944, somewhere in Germany. The Allies had crossed the Rhine, and the war was grinding toward its brutal conclusion. Stern was interrogating a captured German officer, an older man, perhaps in his 50s, a career soldier from the old Prussian military tradition. They spoke in German, naturally. The conversation was cordial, almost professional. The officer answered Stern's questions, not eagerly, but without resistance. He was tired. The war was lost. There was no point in protecting secrets anymore. At one point, the officer paused and looked at Stern carefully. "You speak German very well," he said. "Where are you from?" Stern hesitated. Then, for reasons he never fully understood, he answered honestly. "I'm from Hildesheim." The officer's eyes widened. "Hildesheim? I know Hildesheim. Beautiful town. What did your family do there?" Stern felt something twist inside him. He thought of his parents, his siblings, his childhood home. He thought of the last letters he had received before the deportations began, desperate pleas for help that he could do nothing about. He thought of the silence that followed. "My family," Stern said quietly, "was murdered by people like you." The officer went pale. The room fell silent. This was the war within the war, the personal battle every Ritchie boy fought, even as they extracted intelligence and contributed to Allied victories. These men were not just soldiers. They were survivors of a genocide. And now they were interrogating the soldiers of the regime that had tried to annihilate them. The psychological toll was immense. Many Ritchie boys struggled with the moral complexity of their work. They understood that most German soldiers were not ideological Nazis. Many were conscripts, men who had been drafted, indoctrinated, and sent to fight a war they hadn't chosen. Some were just teenagers, terrified and confused, who had never fired a shot in anger before being captured. And yet these same soldiers had served a regime that had murdered millions. They had worn the uniform of the Wehrmacht, the military force that had enabled the Holocaust. Even if they personally hadn't participated in atrocities, they had been part of the machinery of destruction. How do you interrogate someone who might have guarded the trains that carried your family to the death camps? How do you remain professional, empathetic, effective, when every fiber of your being wants to scream? The Ritchie boys found their own ways to cope. Some compartmentalized their emotions, treating interrogations as purely professional tasks. They focused on the mission, the intelligence, the lives that could be saved. They told themselves that personal feelings had no place in the work. Others used their trauma as motivation. They interrogated German soldiers not with hatred, but with a cold determination to ensure that the Nazi regime was utterly destroyed. Every piece of intelligence they gathered was an act of resistance, a way to strike back at the system that had taken everything from them. And a few maintained a kind of empathy that bordered on the profound. They saw the German soldiers they interrogated as victims too, victims of propaganda, indoctrination, and a monstrous ideology. This didn't excuse the soldiers' actions, but it allowed the Ritchie boys to engage with them as human beings, which made the interrogations more effective. Werner Engress later said, "I didn't want revenge. I wanted justice, and justice required clarity, not emotion. But the emotional toll was inescapable." As the Ritchie boys advanced deeper into Germany, they began to witness the full horror of what the Nazi regime had done. They passed through towns where concentration camps had stood. They saw the skeletal survivors, the mass graves, the evidence of industrialized murder on a scale almost too vast to comprehend. For the Ritchie boys, these discoveries were deeply personal. This was not abstract history or distant atrocity. This was their history, their families, their people. Some Ritchie boys were able to confirm the fates of their relatives. Most learned that their parents, siblings, and extended families had been murdered, gassed at Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, or shot in mass executions across Eastern Europe. Guy Stern's entire family, his parents, his two sisters, his brother, had been deported to the Riga ghetto in Latvia. None of them survived. Stern would spend the rest of his life carrying the weight of that loss, even as he built a new life in America. Martin Selling returned to his hometown of Vienna after the war. He found his childhood home occupied by strangers. His parents had been sent to Auschwitz in 1942. They never returned. The Ritchie boys had escaped the Holocaust by fleeing to America. But they had not escaped it emotionally. It followed them through every interrogation, every captured document, every German town they passed through. And yet, they continued to do their work. They remained professional. They extracted intelligence. They contributed to the Allied victory. This was their form of resistance, not just against the German military, but against the forces of hatred and nihilism that had tried to erase them from existence. They had survived. They had returned, and they had won. But the cost of that victory was written in the silence of empty chairs at dinner tables, in the unanswered letters, in the photographs of faces they would never see again. The Ritchie boys carried two wars inside them, the war they fought for America, and the war they fought against their own grief. And somehow, impossibly, they kept fighting both. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Church bells rang across America. Soldiers embraced in the streets. Newspapers printed headlines in massive type. Victory in Europe. After 6 years of total war, after millions of deaths and unimaginable destruction, Nazi Germany had been defeated. For the Ritchie boys, the moment was bittersweet. They had contributed to this victory in ways few people would ever know. Their intelligence had saved lives, shortened battles, and helped bring down the regime that had tried to destroy them. They had returned to Europe, the continent that had expelled them, and helped liberate it. But for many, the victory felt hollow. The concentration camps had been liberated. The full scope of the Holocaust was now undeniable. 6 million Jews had been murdered. Entire communities had been erased. Families, traditions, cultures, gone. The Ritchie Boys began the painful process of searching for survivors. Red Cross lists were circulated. Refugee organizations compiled names. Telegrams went back and forth across the Atlantic. Some found relatives who had survived, hidden by righteous Gentiles, escaped to neutral countries, or liberated from camps. These reunions were joyous, but also haunted by the weight of all who had not survived. Most Ritchie Boys found only confirmation of loss. Guy Stern learned that his entire family had perished. He would later say, "I survived, but I lost everything that mattered." Martin Selling discovered that his parents had been murdered in Auschwitz in 1942, years before he had even enlisted. Stefan Heym, the novelist who had served as a Ritchie Boy, returned to Germany after the war and confronted the ruins of the country he had once called home. He wrote, "I came back to a graveyard, not just of buildings but of memory." The Ritchie Boys were offered the opportunity to remain in Europe as part of the Allied occupation forces. Many did, working with the military government in Germany, assisting with denazification efforts, and helping to identify war criminals. Some participated in the investigations that led to the Nuremberg trials. They interrogated Nazi officials, translated documents, and provided intelligence that helped build cases against the architects of genocide. But even as they contributed to the pursuit of justice, they were bound by secrecy. Camp Ritchie's operations remained classified. The interrogation techniques, the intelligence methods, the full scope of the Ritchie Boys' contributions, all of it was sealed away in government files marked secret. The men themselves were instructed not to discuss their work. When they returned to civilian life, they were told to be vague about their military service. "I worked in intelligence" was about as specific as they were allowed to be. For decades, the Ritchie Boys honored that silence. They came home to America, some immediately after the war, others after serving in the occupation for a year or two. They returned to a country that was prosperous, optimistic, and eager to move forward. The GI Bill allowed them to attend universities, buy homes, and build careers. Many became teachers, professors, writers, and businessmen. They married, raised families, and integrated into American society. On the surface, they appeared to be ordinary citizens, immigrants who had made good, veterans who had served their country. But inside, they carried stories that no one knew. Stories of interrogations conducted under artillery fire. Stories of prisoners who broke down and revealed secrets that saved lives. Stories of psychological battles fought in the shadows of the greatest war in history. They carried the weight of being both victors and mourners, men who had helped win the war, but who had lost nearly everything in the process. And for the most part, they kept silent, not because they were ashamed, but because they had been trained to keep secrets. Because the work they had done was still classified. And perhaps because speaking about it meant confronting memories that were too painful to revisit. Guy Stern became a professor of German literature, teaching at Wayne State University in Detroit for decades. He rarely spoke about his service until late in life. Werner Angres became a historian, specializing in German history. He wrote academic papers and books, but never publicly discussed his role as a Ritchie Boy until the 2000s. Martin Selling returned to a quiet life, working as a businessman in New York. His children grew up not knowing the full story of what their father had done during the war. The Ritchie Boys faded into the background of history. Their contributions were known only to a handful of military historians and intelligence officials. The broader public, the millions of Americans who celebrated the victory in World War II, had no idea these men existed. It was as if they had never been. But history has a way of refusing to stay buried. The first cracks in the silence came in the 1990s. Historians began to notice references to Camp Ritchie in declassified military documents. Intelligence reports from World War II mentioned interrogations conducted by German-speaking soldiers, but the details were sparse. Who were these men? What had they done? Why had their story been kept secret for so long? Journalists started investigating. They tracked down surviving Ritchie Boys, now in their 70s and 80s, and asked them to share their stories. At first, many were reluctant. Decades of secrecy were hard to break. But slowly, the stories began to emerge. In 1998, a researcher named David Frey began a comprehensive study of Camp Ritchie and the men who trained there. He interviewed dozens of surviving Ritchie Boys, combed through archives, and pieced together a history that had been hidden for more than half a century. His work led to a resurgence of interest in the Ritchie Boys' story. Documentary filmmakers took notice. In 2004, filmmaker Christian Bauer produced a German television documentary titled The Ritchie Boys, bringing their story to a broader audience. In the United States, the story gained traction slowly. In 2011, filmmaker Christian Bauer and Bruce Henderson published books and documentaries highlighting the Ritchie Boys' contributions. Then, in 2014, Bruce Henderson published Sons and Soldiers, the untold story of the Jews who escaped the Nazis and returned with the U.S. Army to fight Hitler. The book became a bestseller, introducing millions of readers to the Ritchie Boys for the first time. Suddenly, the world was listening. Veterans groups began recognizing the Ritchie Boys' contributions. Museums created exhibits dedicated to their story. The U.S. Army published official histories acknowledging the critical role they played in the war. In 2011, the Ritchie Boys were honored at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Guy Stern, now in his 90s, stood before an ER audience and told his story. The story of a boy who had fled Nazi Germany, become an American soldier, and returned to help defeat the regime that had murdered his family. The audience sat in stunned silence. Many wept. In 2021, the surviving Ritchie Boys were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. The legislation recognizing their service passed with bipartisan support. Democrats and Republicans, lawmakers from across the political spectrum, came together to honor men whose contributions had been hidden for too long. Guy Stern, one of the last surviving Ritchie Boys, attended the ceremony. He was 100 years old. He spoke about the importance of remembering history, of honoring those who fought not with weapons, but with knowledge and courage. "We were refugees who became soldiers," he said. "We were outsiders who became insiders. We proved that intelligence, in both senses of the word, could change the course of history." In 2022, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum awarded its Elie Wiesel Award to the Ritchie Boys. The award is given to individuals or groups who have fought against hatred, genocide, and indifference. It is named after Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor and Nobel laureate who spent his life bearing witness to the atrocities of the Nazi regime. The symbolism was profound. The Ritchie Boys, men who had escaped the Holocaust and returned to fight the perpetrators, were being honored by an institution dedicated to ensuring that the Holocaust is never forgotten. The recognition came late in their lives. Most Ritchie Boys had already passed away by the time their story became widely known. But for the survivors, the acknowledgement was deeply meaningful. It meant that their contributions had not been forgotten. It meant that history had finally caught up with them. It meant that the silence had been broken. But more than personal recognition, the rediscovery of the Ritchie Boys' story carries a broader significance. It reminds us that refugees are not liabilities. They are assets. The Ritchie Boys were not a burden on American society. They were one of the most effective intelligence forces the United States has ever deployed. They brought skills, knowledge, and perspective that native-born Americans simply could not replicate. It reminds us that diversity is a strategic advantage. The Ritchie Boys' fluency in German, their cultural understanding, and their personal connection to the fight against Nazism made them uniquely qualified for their mission. Homogeneity could never have produced what they accomplished. It reminds us that justice and revenge are not the same thing. The Ritchie Boys could have approached their work with hatred and brutality, Instead, they used empathy, psychology, and professionalism. They extracted intelligence not through torture, but through understanding. And they were more effective because of it. And it reminds us that history is full of untold stories. Stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. Stories that were classified, overlooked, or forgotten, but which shaped the world we live in today. The Ritchie Boys were not famous generals or celebrated heroes. They were refugees, survivors, and intellectuals who became soldiers. They fought a war that most people never saw, in interrogation rooms and intelligence tents, with words and insight instead of bullets. And they helped win World War II. There is a photograph that captures something essential about the Ritchie Boys. It was taken sometime in 1944 at Camp Ritchie. A group of young men stand in front of a wooden barracks wearing U.S. Army uniforms. They look serious, focused, determined. They could be any group of American soldiers preparing for deployment. But if you look closely, you can see the complexity in their faces. These are not men who grew up dreaming of military glory. These are men who have already lived through trauma, loss, and exile. These are men who have been forced to become something they never imagined they would be. Soldiers fighting against the country of their birth. The photograph is a reminder that identity is not simple. That loyalty is not automatic. That courage can take many forms. The Ritchie Boys were German by birth, American by choice, and Jewish by heritage. They were linguists, psychologists, and warriors. They were victims of the Holocaust and heroes of the Allied victory. They were all of these things at once, and none of them completely. Their story forces us to grapple with uncomfortable questions. What does it mean to be loyal to a country that once expelled you? How do you fight for justice when justice comes too late to save the people you loved? How do you maintain your humanity when confronting those who abandoned theirs? The Ritchie Boys answered these questions not with words, but with actions. They chose to serve. They chose to use their knowledge and skills to fight against evil. They chose empathy over hatred, professionalism over vengeance, and intelligence, in every sense of the word, over brute force. And in doing so, they proved something profound, that the refugees who flee tyranny often become the strongest defenders of freedom. This is not just a historical observation. It is a contemporary lesson. Today, millions of people around the world are refugees, fleeing war, persecution, and violence. They arrive in new countries with nothing but their lives and their stories. They face suspicion, bureaucracy, and often outright hostility. But history tells us that refugees bring more than need. They bring resilience, knowledge, and a deep appreciation for the freedoms that others take for granted. They bring skills and perspectives that enrich the societies that welcome them. The Ritchie Boys are proof of this. They were not a burden on America. They were one of its greatest assets. As we reflect on their story, we must also acknowledge the injustice of their obscurity. For more than 50 years, their contributions were classified, their names unknown, their sacrifices unrecognized. They fought a war that most people never knew existed, and they did it without expectation of glory. This is the nature of intelligence work. It is thankless, invisible, and essential. But it is also a reminder that history is written by those who survive to tell it. And too often, the stories of intelligence operatives, translators, and support personnel are erased in favor of more dramatic narratives about combat and heroism. The Ritchie Boys deserve to be remembered not as footnotes, but as central figures in the Allied victory. They deserve to be remembered not just for what they did, but for who they were. Refugees who became heroes, outsiders who became insiders, victims who became victors. Their legacy is not just military, it is moral. They showed us that knowledge is a weapon, that empathy is a strategy. Understanding your enemy is more effective than hating them. That justice requires clarity, patience, and professionalism. They showed us that the most powerful force in the world is not violence, but truth. The truth extracted from a captured soldier. The truth revealed in a decoded message. The truth that illuminates the path to victory. And they showed us that identity is not a limitation, but a strength. The Ritchie Boys' German heritage was not a liability. It was the very thing that made them so effective. Their refugee status was not a weakness. It was the source of their motivation and resilience. As we close this story, we must ask ourselves, what other stories remain hidden? What other contributions have been forgotten? What other heroes have been erased from history because their work was classified, their backgrounds were complicated, or their narratives didn't fit neatly into the myths we tell ourselves about war and victory? The Ritchie Boys remind us to look deeper, to question the official narratives, and to honor the invisible warriors who fought battles that most people will never see. They remind us that war is not just fought on battlefields, but in minds, in interrogation rooms, in the careful analysis of intelligence. And that the people who fight these battles are often the most unlikely heroes, refugees, intellectuals, survivors who turn their pain into purpose. The Ritchie Boys are gone now, almost all of them. Guy Stern, one of the last survivors, passed away in 2023 at the age of 101. With his death, a living connection to this remarkable story was severed. But their legacy endures. It endures in the military intelligence techniques they pioneered, which are still taught today. It endures in the interrogation methods that emphasize empathy over coercion. It endures in the recognition that diversity is not just morally right, but strategically necessary. And it endures in the simple, powerful truth that refugees are not outsiders to be feared, but potential heroes waiting for a chance to prove their worth. The Ritchie Boys escaped Nazi Germany with nothing. They arrived in America as strangers in a strange land, and they became one of the most effective intelligence forces the United States has ever deployed. They proved that courage is not about fearlessness. It is about facing your fears and acting anyway. That heroism is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, methodical, and invisible. That redemption is possible, even in the darkest of times. Their story is a gift to us, a reminder of what is possible when people are given a chance, when their skills are recognized, when they are welcomed rather than rejected. It is a story of loss and resilience, of exile and return, of trauma transformed into purpose. It is a story that should never be forgotten. If stories like this move you, stories of courage, intelligence, and redemption, join us at Wardiere, because history still whispers if we're willing to listen.